Tonight's story begins in a quiet corner of history, where the wind seems to sigh across an empty landscape and the ocean murmurs in a way that feels older than memory itself. It begins on the western fringe of Scotland, in a place where the land, the sea, and the sky have been arguing for centuries about who really controls the weather. If you stand there long enough, you might decide that the sky usually wins, although the sea makes a convincing attempt every winter. The land, meanwhile, simply endures, which is a habit the people once living there perfected rather well. And so, with that calm introduction, we slowly drift into our story about stone cabins, Scottish families, and the endless Atlantic storms that tested both. Let's take a moment to ease ourselves into the scene. Picture a coastline where the cliffs are not dramatic enough to inspire poets, but tall enough to discourage anyone who dislikes breaking bones. The grass grows in short, uneven tufts because the wind has never agreed to leave it alone. The air carries the smell of salt, seaweed, and a hint of sheep, whose opinions on the weather are mostly unpredictable. Every few miles, one might find an old stone cabin, although find is perhaps too strong a word. Many of these dwellings blended so well with the landscape that visitors often mistook them for particularly determined piles of rocks. These cabins were not built for beauty, nor for comfort, nor even for the sort of architectural pride that makes people stand back and nod in approval. They were built because the wind did not care about personal feelings. The Atlantic storms that rolled across these islands did not ask anyone's permission, nor did they take much notice of human schedules. They simply arrived, uninvited, often in the middle of the night. Families learned long ago that only stone had the patience to listen to a winter storm from beginning to end. Wood was too soft, turf too temporary, and optimism too unreliable. Stone, however, was trustworthy. It also happened to be available in great quantities, which certainly helped. Now, before we move deeper into the past, let's settle into the gentle pace of the story. Think of it as a long walk across a quiet field where nothing surprising happens, except perhaps a stone that looks suspiciously like a sheep, or a sheep that looks suspiciously like a stone. Time passes softly here, and the world has been slow to change. This slowness is precisely what allowed stone cabins to remain such a central part of rural Scottish life for generation after generation. Most of these cabins were small, though small may be a generous description. Some were barely large enough for a family, a fire, and the vague hope that spring would eventually arrive. The walls were thick, sometimes more than 3 feet deep, which was less a stylistic choice and more a conversation between humanity and the wind. The wind requested that the walls not exist. Humans disagreed, and so they made the walls thicker. This negotiation continued for centuries. Let's slip gently into the daily life inside one of these cabins. Imagine a single room, dimly lit, where the smoke from a peat fire decides to stay indoors a little longer than anyone would like. The aroma of peat has a way of clinging to clothes, hair, memories, and possibly the soul itself. A low ceiling stretches above, designed not to create a sense of coziness, but simply because building a tall roof in a place known for storms would be an act of extreme optimism. A small window, if one existed at all, might allow a bit of light to enter, although the window also allowed the occasional gust of wind, which tended to blow out the fire at inconvenient moments. Families lived in these spaces with a kind of quiet determination. They did not expect comfort. They expected survival, and the cabins delivered exactly that service, no more and no less. When the winter storms arrived, the walls absorbed the fury. Outside, The wind screeched like a frustrated ghost. Inside, the family sat by the fire, saying very little, because talking loudly would have required more enthusiasm than winter allowed. Life moved at a slow pace, guided mostly by the weather, the availability of peat, and the number of sheep that had wandered off that week. Let's drift now into the origins of these cabins. They did not appear suddenly, of course. Their design evolved over centuries, shaped by the practicality and the stubbornness of the people who lived along Scotland's coasts. The earliest homes were made of turf and earth, structures that blended beautifully into the hills but tended to collapse inconveniently. Over time, as storms continued to express their opinion of human architecture, builders shifted to stone. The logic was simple. If the land is mostly rock, and the weather keeps trying to dismantle your house, you might as well build the house out of the same material the weather has been unable to move for millions of years. The construction process was patient. Stones were gathered from fields, beaches, or whatever place seemed willing to part with them. These stones were then stacked carefully, sometimes with mortar but often without. The style of dry stone building required precision and an understanding of how gravity works, which, to be fair, most people understood reasonably well. Each stone had to rest in a way that made sense, which is more than can be said for many things in life. Some cabins included wooden beams for support, although wood was a precious resource in many parts of Scotland, where trees preferred not to grow for reasons known only to themselves. Roofs were usually made of thatch or turf layered over wooden rafters. The turf helped insulate the cabin and, in particularly charming cases, sprouted grass of its own, giving the home the appearance of having hair. This natural camouflage occasionally convinced sheep that the roof was an acceptable place to stand, which was not ideal for the rafters, but was, apparently, quite amusing to the sheep. Inside these modest dwellings, life followed the rhythm of the seasons. In warmer months, if one can call them warm, families worked outdoors, fishing, farming, gathering peat, tending animals, repairing tools, and occasionally wondering why they lived in a place where the sun seemed to hide so often. During colder months, much of life happened indoors. People mended nets, spun wool, told stories, sharpened tools, and quietly hoped that the roof would not leak that year. Although leaks were practically guaranteed, especially during storms, households treated them with a kind of resigned dignity. Let's drift a little deeper into the environment itself, because the environment was as much a character in this story as the families who lived there. The Atlantic storms were legendary. They rolled across the ocean in immense waves of wind and rain, dragging sea spray far inland. The storms announced themselves well before arrival, with the sound of the wind rising gently into a distant roar. Fishermen learned to read the clouds, which often formed in strange patterns that resembled everything from stretched wool to mildly annoyed faces. When a storm was coming, the air grew colder, the gulls flew lower, and the entire coastline seemed to brace itself. In such conditions, the stone cabins stood their ground. The heavy walls did not sway. The low roofs did not lift. The small entrances minimized the chance that the wind would try to join the family inside, although the wind occasionally managed to do so anyway. Families barred the door, checked the fire, gathered near the warmest corner, and waited. Waiting was an important part of life here. Storms could last hours or days. The world outside became an indistinct blur of grey, punctuated by the sound of rain slapping the walls with considerable enthusiasm. The structure of the cabins helped preserve warmth. Thick stone walls retained heat, although they also retained cold when the fire went out, which meant that forgetting to gather peat was ill. The floors were often dirt or stone, which did not offer much insulation but did offer consistency. A layer of straw or woven rushes softened the experience. Beds were arranged near the fire, because sleeping further away from the fire would be an experiment with frostbite. The intimacy of the space forced families to spend a great deal of time together, which likely strengthened their bonds or, in some cases, strengthened their desire to occasionally walk to the next village for a moment of quiet. Food storage was simple, as one might expect. Meat, fish, barley, oats, and whatever vegetables the garden generously produced were stored in woven baskets or clay containers. Dried fish was common. It was not always delicious, but it was consistent. And consistency is a valuable trait in areas known for unpredictable weather. Water came from nearby streams, though during storms it was collected from rain. Barrels are scooped from small depressions where the rain felt comfortable, settling. Let's continue drifting through this peaceful narrative by examining the subtle social world that surrounded these cabins. Communities were small. Neighbors lived close enough to help one another, but far enough to give the illusion of privacy. People visited one another often, sharing news, food, tools, and the occasional patched-up fishing net. The cabins themselves acted as meeting points during harsh winters. If someone's roof collapsed, neighbors repaired it together. If someone's flock wandered off, neighbors assisted in the search. The landscape was too unforgiving to allow for loneliness. So communities learned cooperation out of necessity. Religion played an important role in daily life. Some families kept small crosses or icons above the hearth. Others relied on older superstitions, believing that certain stones near the cabin protected against storms. Whether or not these beliefs had any measurable effect is unclear, but they did provide a reassuring sense of control, which is more than most storms offered. As we move gently to another corner of our story, let's consider the quiet labor that went into maintaining these cabins. Roofs had to be repaired regularly. Thatched roofs, in particular, enjoyed falling apart whenever they felt like it. Storms blew loose pieces away, leaving patches that required careful layering of new bundles. Turf roofs had their own personality, often absorbing water like a sponge and then sagging ominously over the rafters. Homeowners responded to these behaviors with the kind of patience people usually reserve for troublesome pets. The walls of the cabins required attention to. Stones shifted slowly, like lazy animals. Gaps formed, letting in wind, rain, and occasionally curious insects. Mortar crumbled over time. Repairs were continuous, though never urgent enough to cause alarm. Life moved slowly, and so did the process of maintenance. A loose stone was noted, and then addressed whenever someone had enough daylight, energy, or mild irritation to deal with it. Let's drift now toward the role of peat, a material that shaped daily life in ways that might seem surprising to anyone unfamiliar with windy Scottish islands. Peat was the primary fuel source for many families. Harvested from bogs, peat was cut into bricks, dried, and stacked near the cabin. Its aroma during burning was distinctive, which is a polite way of saying unforgettable. The steady glow of a peat fire warmed the home, cooked meals, and provided the only light during long winter nights besides the moon, which often hid behind clouds. The act of gathering peat was quiet, steady work. People cut long trenches in the bog, sliced blocks with a handled tool, and laid them out to dry. The drying process required weeks of patience and a minimal number of rainstorms, which was rather optimistic in Scotland, but people did their best. Families often took pride in how neatly their peat stacks were arranged. A well-ordered stack was a sign of good planning, and also a reassurance that winter would not be entirely miserable. Now let's float gently toward the emotional landscape of life in these cabins. The storms shaped not only homes, but also the mindset of the people within them. Few things teach patience quite like waiting for a 3-day storm to pass while listening to the wind complained loudly against the walls. Children grew up understanding the rhythm of the weather, learning which sounds meant danger and which sounds simply meant the usual sort of inconvenience. Adults carried a sense of calm resilience. They did not romanticize hardship, but they accepted it with a kind of quiet humor. In many stories and journals from these regions, there is a recurring theme, the strange comfort found in the sound of a storm when one is safely indoors. The wind, though fierce, became a sort of familiar companion. The rain drumming on the roof acted as an irregular lullaby. The crackling peat fire provided contrast, its soft glow reminding everyone that life persisted steadily despite the weather's dramatic tendencies. The cabins, humble as they were, held these small worlds together. The coast remains rugged. The sea still breathes in slow, powerful waves. The wind continues its endless experiments in rearranging everything that is not nailed down. And through it all, the stone cabins endure, quiet and unmoving, shaped by centuries of storms and human determination. Iway will drift deeper into these coastal communities. We will explore how the families adapted their routines throughout the year, how their tools and traditions evolved, and how the cabins themselves became symbols of endurance in a place where nature always had the final word. For now, let the last image be simple. A small stone cabin, half lost in the mist, a warm glow at its center, the storm whispering along its walls, and a family resting inside, trusting the stones to do what they had always done. Now, let's drift quietly back into that small stone cabin where we left the family resting through the storm. The fire is still glowing, although it has settled into a comfortable smolder that seems quite proud of itself for having survived the night. The wind outside has not yet decided whether it wants to continue its performance or take a break. So for now, it hums and rattles in a manner that suggests ongoing negotiations with the roof. Inside, the family begins another day, doing so with the unhurried calm that comes from knowing the world outside will not be any more exciting than it was the day before. We pick up the story in the soft grey light of a winter morning. A faint glow leaks through the edges of the window, which does its best to pretend it is a respectable source of illumination. In truth, the window admits just enough daylight to announce that the sun exists somewhere behind a dense layer of cloud. The family wakes slowly. There is no hurry. There rarely is. Life here does not operate on a strict schedule, except for those enforced by the seasons or the sheep. And the sheep do not always cooperate. Breakfast is simple, predictable, and pleasantly unremarkable. A bit of porridge made from oats stored in a wooden box near the wall. Perhaps a small piece of dried fish left over from the previous summer's catch. There is also water, which tastes like whatever stream seems to be behaving itself that week. The meal is quiet. A child stirs the porridge with deliberate patience, as if each rotation of the spoon might warm the entire cabin. The adults sit near the fire, adding small handfuls of peat to revive its enthusiasm. The fire obliges, producing a faint crackle that sounds somewhat like contentment. As the day begins, we drift into the larger rhythm of winter life. Outside, the world is a monochrome painting, all greys and muted greens. the grass bending in the wind like tired travelers. Inside the cabin, tasks unfold at a steady pace, each one familiar and necessary. Winter is not a time for ambition. It is a time for maintenance, reflection, and staying warm enough to avoid regretting one's life choices. One of the morning chores involves checking the walls for any new leaks or drafts that might have appeared during the night's storm. A thin finger of cold air can slip through the smallest gap between two stones. So the adults move slowly along the interior perimeter of the cabin. They run their hands near the joints, feeling for interruptions in the temperature. When a gap is discovered, it is marked mentally for later repair. Repairs are never urgent, but they do have a way of accumulating, and it is generally agreed that addressing them sooner rather than much later is the wiser path. The roof also demands regular inspection. Although inspecting the roof during winter storms is a questionable idea, and most people prefer to wait for a moment of relative calm. Climbing atop a turf roof in high winds is an activity best enjoyed by no one. For now, they assume the roof has held, partly because checking it is unpleasant, and partly because optimism, even cautious optimism, is a useful tool during winter. Let's move gently into the world outside the cabin, where the land stretches outward in quiet resilience. The rocky terrain near the coast is dotted with patches of heather and small pools of water that never seem entirely sure whether they want to freeze. A few hardy birds call from the cliffs, although their calls are mostly lost to the wind. The ocean churns patiently, sending waves toward the shore that break themselves on rocks without much ceremony. It is a landscape that encourages reflection simply because there is very little else to distract the mind in this environment. Families structure their days according to what the season allows. Winter days are short, and daylight is used for tasks that require visibility. Gathering peat, fetching water, checking the livestock, and ensuring the fishing nets stored by the wall have not been chewed on by an overly curious mouse. Indoor tasks are saved for the late afternoon and evening. Wool is carded and spun. Tools are sharpened. Simple repairs are made to clothing, baskets, and the occasional fishing hook. There is also storytelling, though storytelling here is not performed with grand gestures or dramatic flair. Instead, it is a gentle, meandering way of passing time, filled with quiet pauses and the sort of dry humor that does not startle anyone. The stories tend to be old, often older than the cabins themselves. Tales of fishermen who misread the weather and ended up drifting farther from shore than expected. Stories of strange lights seen on the horizon, which might have been ships or spirits, or simply the imagination enjoying a moment of creativity. There are stories about animals, especially sheep, who occasionally demonstrate an impressive ability to escape from enclosures that were supposedly sheep-proof. These stories are shared with mild amusement and very little urgency. Let's drift now toward the changing of the seasons, because the stone cabin's role shifts gently as the year moves forward. Winter eventually softens into early spring, although in this part of Scotland, spring is often indistinguishable from a slightly warmer version of winter. The storms continue, though they lose some of their earlier enthusiasm. Snow becomes rain. Rain becomes mist. Mist becomes a thick, damp fog that invites itself into every crevice of the landscape. Spring brings new tasks. The soil must be turned, though the soil often behaves as though it has no interest in being turned at all. Families plant barley, oats, and vegetables in small plots beside the cabin. The ground is rocky, and every planting season seems to reveal a new collection of stones that appear to have grown over the winter. These stones are cleared away and added to the already impressive perimeter walls that surround the property. The walls serve multiple purposes. They mark boundaries, they keep sheep from wandering into the ocean, and they give the impression that humans have some control over their environment. The cabins themselves become slightly livelier during this season. Windows are opened, albeit reluctantly, to let in fresh air and let out the accumulated smoke of winter. The interior is cleaned through a process that mostly involves sweeping the floor and relocating dust to another corner. Tools that have been resting through winter are brought out and examined. Fishing lines are repaired. Boats are checked for leaks, which they almost always have, because it is their nature. Let's take a quiet moment to reflect on the architecture of these stone cabins as they transition from winter shelters to springtime homes. Their design, though simple, carries a subtle elegance shaped entirely by necessity. The thick walls, moderate temperature, keeping out winter cold and shielding the interior from spring winds. The small windows minimize heat loss and discourage the wind from joining the conversation inside. The low roof prevents drafts and anchors the home against the force of the storms. Many cabins also have a small adjacent structure used for storing tools, peat or animal feed. This structure is usually built from the same stone as the main cabin, although it is often slightly shorter and less dignified. Some cabins include a small enclosure made of dry stone for keeping animals during especially harsh weather. Sheep, being independent thinkers, occasionally decide to enter or exit these enclosures at entirely inconvenient times, and families have learned that arguing with sheep rarely leads to productive outcomes. As spring progresses, families venture farther from the cabin. Fishing becomes more frequent as the sea grows slightly calmer. The men often head out in small boats made of wood and tar, while the women tend to the gardens, gather herbs, and maintain the household. Children help with lighter tasks, such as collecting eggs, fetching water, and wondering why adults spend so much time fixing nets that the sea clearly intends to break again. Let's drift into early summer, when the winds soften and the landscape briefly pretends to be hospitable. The grass grows taller. The heather blooms in muted purple tones that seem to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The days stretch longer, and the extra daylight allows families to accomplish tasks that were postponed during winter. Household repairs are a major part of summer life. The roof, which survived the storms, must now be thoroughly inspected. Thatch is pulled away where it has grown thin. New bundles of straw are woven in. Turf roofs are trimmed and smoothed. Loose stones in the walls are reset with careful taps of a hammer. Cracks in the mortar are filled. The cabin, which weathered the storms in stoic silence, is gently persuaded to prepare for the next round of storms in the distant autumn. Summer is also the season for gathering peat. The bogs are at their driest, and the long daylight hours provide ample time for cutting, stacking, and drying the bricks. Peat cutting is not glamorous work. People stand in quiet conversation, slicing the bog into neat blocks that resemble primitive loaves of bread. These are laid in rows to dry, forming geometric patterns across the landscape. The stacks must be turned periodically to ensure even drying, a task that is repetitive but oddly calming. During these long summer days, the cabin's interior becomes a cooler retreat. The stone walls absorb the mild warmth of the sun but never grow hot. The inside of the cabin feels still, shaded, and gently cool. Meals are lighter. Fish is more common. Fresh greens from the garden appear on the table. The fire burns smaller, since warming the cabin is no longer the primary concern. Instead, the fire is used for cooking and for keeping insects from becoming too curious. Neighbors visit more often during summer. Doors are left open for longer periods. Stories are exchanged about the storms of the past winter, as though those storms belonged to another lifetime. People laugh quietly at memories of the wind blowing peat dust into their soup, or the roof dripping water exactly onto someone's boot while they slept. These stories are told with gentle resignation and mild amusement, which is the prevailing emotional palette of the region. Let's drift now into the social fabric that binds these communities together. People living in stone cabins were not isolated, despite the rugged landscape. Villages formed along the coast, loosely connected by footpaths that wound through rocky fields and stretches of heather. Each village might contain a handful of cabins, a communal storage structure, and perhaps a small chapel. People walked these paths regularly, visiting neighbors, sharing resources, and offering assistance during seasonal tasks. Cooperation was not just preferred, it was necessary. Gathering seaweed for fertilizer, repairing boats, hunting for driftwood, or searching for lost livestock required group effort. When storms damaged a roof, neighbors helped secure new thatch. When fishing nets tore, multiple hands mended them. The cabins thus existed not only as individual shelters, but also as parts of a larger network of support. Let's wander quietly into autumn, when the landscape begins to shift again. The heather fades. The winds return with renewed interest. The daylight shortens slowly. Families begin preparing the cabin for another winter. Peat stacks are gathered and brought inside or stored under shelter. Fishing equipment is cleaned and tucked away. Tools are checked. The garden is trimmed back. Herbs are hung from the cabin rafters, too dry, giving the interior a fragrant but slightly chaotic appearance. Autumn storms arrive with a familiar sense of determination. The first heavy winds test the roof, the walls, and the patience of the families living inside. Water drips through in places where repairs might have been performed more optimistically than accurately. The cabin creaks and settles, as if clearing its throat before the long winter ahead. But the structure holds. It always does. These cabins have faced centuries of storms, and another year's worth of weather is simply expected. Inside, the fire becomes important again. Its warmth defines the space. Families gather closer. Daily tasks grow quieter. As the wind howls outside, the cabin becomes a cocoon of steady comfort. Children listen to stories of older storms, and the adults recall winters from decades past. The sound of the wind on the stones becomes a familiar rhythm, sometimes steady, sometimes chaotic, but always present. Now, let's move gently into the emotional texture of this life. Because living in a stone cabin shaped not only the practical aspects of survival, but also the mindset of the people. The storms taught patience. The long winters taught endurance. The quiet summers taught appreciation for small comforts. Families developed a steady, unhurried approach to life. They did not chase excitement. They valued simplicity, resilience, and the satisfaction of tasks completed at the proper pace. Their humor, too, reflected the environment. It was dry, subtle, almost invisible unless one listened closely. People joked about the weather, even though the weather rarely reciprocated the kindness. They laughed about sheep escaping through gaps in walls that had not existed the day before. They shared wry comments about roofs that leaked only on the one night everyone had gone to bed early. These jokes created a shared understanding that life was not always easy, but it was still worth smiling at. Let's step back again and look at the cabin from outside. Evening has settled across the land. The wind has picked up, but only slightly. The stone walls stand solid. A faint glow escapes from the window. Inside, the family sits by the fire, preparing for the winter ahead with calm and practiced ease. The cabin is more than a shelter. It is a rhythm, a habit, a companion shaped by centuries of weather and human determination. It waits patiently for the coming storms, knowing that it has seen all of this before. The evening settles gently over the stone cabin, and as we drift into another quiet part of the story, the landscape seems to exhale. The wind softens for a moment, almost as if it is considering whether to begin another restless night or allow the family a brief interlude of calm. Inside the cabin, the fire glows with a steady warmth, casting slow-moving shadows along the stone walls. No one speaks loudly. This is not the sort of environment that encourages loud voices. Even the crackling of the peat fire seems careful not to disturb anyone's thoughts. We pick up from this peaceful moment and drift into the deeper habits of winter living, because winter in these coastal regions was never just a season. It was a full occupation. As the days grew shorter, the cabin became the center of every routine. The weather outside, though unpredictable, always returned to familiar patterns. Long winds from the west, heavy rains arriving sideways, and an occasional frost that decorated the stones with a thin, crystalline pattern that no one admired for more than a few seconds before retreating into the warmth again. Inside the cabin, the simplest act, such as stirring a pot of barley soup, became part of a winter-long rhythm. People moved slowly, not out of laziness, but out of practicality. Quick movements are rarely rewarded in cramped stone rooms, especially when the ceiling is low enough to remind taller individuals that standing fully upright is a luxury best saved for summertime. The slowness of life absorbed into the walls. Even conversation took on a measured pace, with long pauses between sentences, as though everyone were agreeing silently that words should be used. Sparingly to preserve energy, each morning began with the tending of the fire. Peat bricks were chosen, each with its own personality. Some burned hot, others reluctantly, and some seemed to exist solely to produce smoke that behaved as though it were seeking the quickest route into someone's eyes. The family knew these distinctions well. The father of the household, or sometimes the eldest child, would poke at the embers to coax them awake. A thin line of heat would appear, a small glow that slowly widened until the fire reclaimed its usual enthusiasm. Once the fire was steady, breakfast followed. Oats, again, perhaps with a sprinkling of dried berries if the previous summer had been charitable enough to provide them. The meal was eaten slowly, because eating quickly would imply an eagerness to begin the day's work, and no one in the cabin wished to set such a precedent. After breakfast came the inspection of the interior. Winter often introduced minor inconveniences into the home. A cold draft that appeared overnight, a patch of dampness on the wall that suggested a particularly determined raindrop had found an unexpected pathway, or perhaps a piece of thatch from the roof that had decided to fall indoors without warning. Repairs were rarely done immediately. Instead, they were acknowledged in a thoughtful, contemplative manner. Someone would stand beneath the dripping spot and say something like, "That shouldn't be happening," in a tone that implied the problem would be addressed eventually. And eventually, it was. Let's drift outward from the cabin for a moment and visit the winter landscape as it stretched across these coastal regions. Winter mornings often looked deceptively calm from indoors. The world outside would be dim but peaceful, with the coastline shrouded in a soft, pale light that made even the rugged cliffs appear gentle. But as soon as anyone stepped out the door, the wind reminded them that appearances can be misleading. Gusts swept across the land with impressive motivation, tugging at cloaks, hoods, baskets, and occasionally small children. People learned to brace themselves before opening the cabin door, placing one foot forward and leaning into the wind just enough to avoid being immediately pushed sideways. Sheep, meanwhile, lived their winter lives with a sort of patient absurdity. Their thick wool protected them, and their intelligence or lack of enthusiasm for deep thinking shielded them from stress. They stood in groups on hillsides, staring into the wind as though they had been assigned a task they did not fully understand but were completing anyway. Families checked on their sheep daily, making sure they had not wandered into the sea or onto the roof. Sheep had an uncanny ability to find themselves in places that defied logical explanation. Winter fishing was limited, but some households still attempted it when the sea permitted. This was, of course, dependent on the ocean's mood, which varied from moderately annoyed to actively hostile. On the rare winter morning, when the waves appeared tolerable, groups of men ventured to the shore with small boats. They rowed slowly, watching the water for signs of shifting wind. The fish they caught, usually cod, herring, or haddock, brought home, cleaned, and dried near the fire. The smell, which permeated the cabin for days, was something everyone learned to accept without enthusiasm. Now let's drift gently into the quieter evenings, when the storm winds were at their loudest, and yet life inside the cabin felt strangely insulated from the chaos outside. These long nights created space for stories, small tasks, and simple comforts. The family would gather near the fire, not in a dramatic storytelling circle, but rather in the ordinary arrangement of people who have nowhere else to sit. Someone might mend a fishing net, threading twine carefully through the old knots. Another might scrape earth from a pair of boots or weave straw into a small household mat. And someone else, usually a child with more imagination than experience, would ask for a story. The stories were rarely exciting. They involved ancestors who once owned sheep that behaved slightly better than the current sheep, or fishermen who saw unusual shapes in the fog and returned to shore, insisting they had encountered a sea creature, although most listeners quietly assumed they were just tired. There were stories about spirits, too, but even these tended to be understated. Instead of fear, they inspired the same resigned tone people used when discussing leaky roofs. If there were spirits wandering around, they were probably doing their best, just like everyone else. During these evenings, one could feel the bond between the family and the cabin itself. The stones absorbed the warmth of the fire. The hearth glowed softly. The low ceiling brought everyone physically closer, creating a sense of shared quiet that people living in modern houses rarely experience. If a storm grew particularly strong, the cabin made small noises settling cracks, shifting timbers, or a brief shiver of wind pressing against the walls. These sounds were familiar and therefore comforting. They meant the cabin was doing exactly what it was built to do. Let's drift into another layer of winter life: the role of community during harsh weather. Even though the storms isolated each family within their cabin, they were never truly alone. Villagers maintained a subtle communication system, one based more on habit than design. If a chimney did not produce smoke for too many hours, neighbors noticed. If a path remained untouched by footprints for longer than expected, someone would walk over to check. People visited one another with small offerings, piece of dried fish, some extra peat, or the entertainment value of hearing someone else complain about the weather. These visits were simple and practical, but they reinforced trust. Winter gatherings sometimes occurred in the largest cabin of the village, where several families would sit together for warmth and shared company. Children played simple games with stones or carved toys. Adults exchanged news, which often consisted of updates about sheep, fishing, peat stacks, or minor roof catastrophes. The storms did not disrupt community life. They simply relocated it indoors. Let's drift slowly into the psychological side of living in stone cabins through endless winters. Resilience here was not a heroic trait. It was a quiet, steady familiarity with discomfort. People learned not to expect luxury, and because of that, they found contentment in small successes. A morning without rain, a meal without smoke stinging the eyes, a night during which the wind did not sound actively aggressive. These moments mattered. They balanced the hardships. The landscape shaped the people just as much as the cabins shaped their daily life. The constant presence of the sea taught attentiveness. The mountains taught caution. The bogs taught patience, especially when someone stepped in a patch that looked solid but clearly was not. The storms taught humility, gently reminding everyone that no one truly wins an argument with the Atlantic. Let's now drift into early spring once more, continuing the cycle of life inside the stone cabin, but this time paying closer attention to the transition from winter's confinement to spring's cautious optimism. As the air warmed slightly, the storm patterns changed. Rain replaced snow. Mist replaced rain. The world outside the cabin became green again, though in a subdued, moss-like way. Families stepped outdoors more frequently, blinking into the pale light as though rediscovering a part of their own lives. Tools that had been stored all winter were brought out for inspection. Some needed sharpening. Others needed minor repairs. Fishing nets, expanded across the ground outside the cabin, were examined stretch by stretch. Any winter damage, caused by mice or careless storage, was repaired with fresh twine. Children played cautiously nearby, careful not to tangle themselves in the nets, because the adults were not in the mood to perform acrobatics to untangle them. Gardens also demanded attention. The soil, damp and rocky, had to be loosened. Stones had to be removed again, because stones apparently enjoyed returning to the soil every winter. The first seeds were planted carefully. No one expected immediate results. Patience was simply another tool in the household. The sheep, now slightly less windblown, were shorn as the weather warmed. Shearing was a slow, methodical task performed with simple tools. The wool was washed, dried, and stored in bundles for spinning later. The sheep tolerated the process with their usual indifference, although their expressions afterwards suggested they were slightly embarrassed by how thin they suddenly appeared. Let's move now into a quieter topic: the subtle relationship between humans and the stone itself. Every stone in the cabin had been placed by hand. Families recognized certain stones the way one might recognize an old acquaintance. There was the long stone near the hearth that always felt slightly warmer than the others. The round stone near the door that served as a step. The flat stone beneath the window where someone always rested a cup of water. These stones formed the vocabulary of the home. They were familiar, dependable, and unchanging. Stones outside the cabin played roles as well. Some marked paths. Some acted as boundaries. Some served as landmarks for sheep herding, fishing, or simply finding one's way in fog thick enough to hide the entire world. The land itself was a giant map made of stone, and the people navigated it with instinctive ease. Let's return once more to the cabin interior. The day is closing. The fire has been fed for the evening. The family settles into their usual places. Someone near the hearth to tend the flames. Someone near the window to watch the fading light. Someone near the wall repairing a tool that had been used one too many times. The wind begins to whisper again, perhaps signaling the arrival of another storm. Though no one seems particularly troubled by the possibility, the cabin endures. The stones hold. The family rests. And the world outside continues its ancient patterns, unchanged and unhurried. The wind is beginning to settle again as we slip back into the quiet world of the stone cabin. Evening has deepened, and the hearth's glow flickers gently across the room, softening the edges of the stones and giving them a tired sort of dignity, as though they have been patiently holding up the roof for so long that they now deserve a moment of relaxation. The family moves about in no particular hurry. The pace of life here rarely changes, and even when it does, it tends to do so politely as we continue this story. Let's drift into the deeper rhythms of early summer, when the cabin becomes not only a shelter but also a workshop, a storage space, a family gathering place, and occasionally a rather confused barn. The days grow longer. The air gains a softer warmth. The storms do not disappear entirely. Of course, this is Scotland. After Albert, they grow less enthusiastic. Instead of hurling rain sideways, the sky offers the occasional drizzle that seems unsure of its purpose. Inside the cabin, the morning begins with more light than in winter. A pale stream of sunshine sneaks through the small window, landing on the table in a manner that suggests the sun has just remembered that these families exist. The adults wake first. They rise slowly, partly because the stone floor is cold, and partly because no one is eager to be the first person to face the day's list of tasks. Someone eventually stirs the fire, giving it a few patient pokes until the peat catches. The fire awakens reluctantly, as though protesting the idea of effort. Breakfast is slightly more varied in summer. There may be some fresh herbs mixed into the porridge, or a small piece of recently caught fish. A jug of water sits on the table, its surface reflecting the light with a calmness that seems almost out of place in this landscape. Meals are still quiet affairs, filled mostly with the gentle scrape of spoons and the occasional sigh. After breakfast, the real work of the day begins. Summer is the most productive time of the year, and every family member, regardless of age, has their own role. Let's drift through these tasks, one by one, taking our time, observing each movement with the same slow clarity the families themselves practiced. The first major task is tending the fields, though fields might be a generous word. Much of the soil near the cabin is rocky, and the patches suitable for planting are small and scattered. Still, families work these modest plots with care. They pull weeds that seem determined to reclaim the land. They check the growth of barley and oats, occasionally murmuring encouraging words to the plants, though the plants rarely respond. The earth here requires patience. It does not give generously, but it gives enough. Next comes the gathering of seaweed, a surprisingly important task. Seaweed washed ashore in great tangles after storms served as fertilizer. Families walked along the coastline, collecting the tangled masses into woven baskets. It was heavy work, with the added challenge of the sea breeze repeatedly throwing salt into the face of anyone who dared turn toward the waves. Once carried inland, the seaweed was spread across the fields, feeding the soil and ensuring the future crops might look slightly less unimpressive. let's drift toward another essential summer task: repairing fishing gear. Nets were unpacked from storage and stretched across the grass. The entire family participated in this ritual. The adults examined each knot with the seriousness usually reserved for scholarly study. Children sat nearby with needles and twine, learning to mend small tears. The process was repetitive, calm, and strangely soothing. The nets had survived years of storms, heavy catches, and the occasional unhelpful rock. Their survival relied on attention, just like everything else in this environment. The boats, too, required care. Many families owned a small wooden vessel, patched and repaired so many times that its original shape was more of a suggestion than an actual design. Boats were hauled onto shore, inspected plank by plank. Soft spots were replaced. Tar was heated and spread across the seams. The smell of hot tar drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of the sea and the damp grass. Summer repairs were not optional. A boat that leaked in winter might cost lives, so even the laziest member of the household found themselves motivated to help. Let's drift back inside the cabin for a moment, where another world of summer work unfolds. Wool spinning becomes a daily task after the spring shearing. Bundles of wool are washed and carded, the fibers aligned to prepare for spinning. Women sit by the window or near the hearth, even in summer, turning the wool into yarn with a spindle. The motion is steady, circular, and meditative. The sound of the spindle worry fills the room with a quiet sense of purpose. Yarn is then woven into cloth during the long afternoons. Looms are set up in whichever part of the cabin is least inconvenient. The rhythmic clack of the loom continues for hours, producing fabric that will later become clothing, blankets, or bags. Colors are limited, mostly shades of cream, brown, and grape. The patterns vary. Families weave subtle stripes and checks, creating designs that reflect the slow, methodical nature of their days. Let's step outside again and follow the family into the wider community. Because summer is also a time for social activity. Neighbors visit more frequently. Paths between the cabins become well-trodden. People greet each other with gestures that could be mistaken for impatience, but are actually the local version of affection. Children play along the hillsides, inventing games that involve stones, sticks, and the occasional unsuspecting sheep. Adults gather to share news of the fishing routes, the condition of the soil, or rumors about a distant village where the weather may or may not be slightly better. Communal work also becomes more common in summer. Large tasks, such as repairing shared storage buildings or strengthening stone walls around the grazing fields, require many hands. Villagers gather in groups, moving stones from one place to another with calm efficiency. Conversations are sparse, but there is comfort in the shared effort. The work binds them together as much as the storms do in winter. Now let's drift toward midsummer, when daylight seems determined to stretch itself as far as possible. The evenings feel long and golden, though the sun remains modest, never shining too brightly. On these evenings, families sit outside the cabin on flat stones warmed by the day. They eat simple meals: bread, fish, greens, and perhaps a few berries. The sea breeze carries the scent of salt and kelp. The waves roll in with predictable rhythm. For a moment, the world feels reasonably pleasant, which is about as close as this region gets to perfection. During these calmer evenings, songs are sometimes shared. Not loud songs, not jubilant songs. Soft, repetitive melodies that drift gently over the land. Songs about fishing, storms, ancestors, and sheep that behaved marginally better than modern sheep. The melodies float into the air and merge with the sound of the sea. These songs have been sung for centuries and will be sung for centuries more, because they require little explanation and carry a certain quiet endurance. Let's drift toward autumn once again, moving slowly through the seasonal cycle. Autumn brings a familiar chill. Leaves darken. The sky grows moodier. The storms wake up from their summer nap. Families begin storing food for winter, drying fish, preserving barley, collecting nuts and berries from the surrounding land. The cabin gradually fills with bundles of herbs, stacks of peat, and baskets of produce. Space becomes limited, and navigating the interior requires careful stepping. Autumn is also the time for checking the structural integrity of the cabin before winter arrives. The roof is inspected first. Any loose thatch is replaced. Turf is pressed back into place. Stones that shifted during summer heat are realigned. The door frame is checked to ensure it does not rattle too dramatically in strong winds. People repaired their homes with the same patience they used to repair nets, tools, and relationships. Soon enough, the first winter storms return. Families are prepared. They check the peat supply, secure the animals, cover the small boat, and retreat indoors. The storm announces itself. Gradually the sky darkens. The wind rises, and the cabin begins to hum with the subtle vibrations of approaching weather. No one panics. Storms are old acquaintances. Not friendly, exactly, but familiar enough to greet with a sigh rather than fear. Inside, the fire becomes the center of the world again. Its warm glow pushes back the gloom. Someone keeps watch over the pot hanging above the flames. The pot usually contains some combination of barley, root vegetables, herbs, and whatever fish happened to surrender itself recently. The smell fills the cabin with a sense of comfort, though calling it delicious might be a stretch. The storm outside gains intensity. Rain taps against the stones. Wind curls around the corners of the cabin, searching for weaknesses. Occasionally, a stray gust squeezes through a crack, brushing past someone's shoulder like a cold finger. The family shifts slightly closer to the fire. Hours pass like this. The storm builds, peaks, and slowly releases its energy. The cabin, however, remains steady. The stones do not bend. The roof does not lift. It is a quiet triumph of engineering, determination, and stubbornness. Let's drift deeper into another layer of this life, the emotional weight of returning storms. Even though families faced these storms every year, each new arrival carried memories of old ones. Children remembered nights when the wind seemed louder than thought. Adults remembered storms that damaged boats or scattered sheep across the hills. Elders remembered storms that once tore through the village with frightening strength. These memories did not inspire fear. They inspired preparedness. During long winter nights, while storms raged outside, families often reflected on the past year. They spoke softly about the changes in the village. A child who had grown taller, a neighbor who had moved away, a good fishing season, or a difficult harvest. Nothing was rushed. Conversations drifted like smoke. Let's step into the heart of a winter evening. The fire burns low, though steadily. The family sits wrapped in woolen cloaks. The youngest child, half asleep, rests against a parent's arm. The light reveals the textures of the room. Rough stone walls, wooden beams darkened by years of smoke, bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, tools neatly arranged along a shelf. At moments like this, the cabin feels like a living thing, a breathing companion that has sheltered generations. Every stone, every crevice, every draft feels woven into the family's story. The storms outside belong to the world, but the warmth inside belongs to them. As the night deepens, the storm slowly begins to fade. The cabin grows quieter. The fire crackles gently. Someone rises to place another peat brick on the flames. It catches easily, shining a soft orange glow across the room. The storm has quieted again as we return to the stone cabin. Though quieted in this region usually means the wind has decided to mutter rather than shout. The sky is a soft grey, the kind that looks as though it has been washed too many times. The air is damp, settling on the stones like a thin blanket of moisture. Nothing dramatic is happening, which is perfectly acceptable in a place that relies on uneventfulness for its sense of order. The family inside the cabin is waking slowly. The fire, still alive from the previous night, releases a faint plume of smoke that curls lazily through the chimney. As if stretching after a long rest, we settle back into the story at this gentle pace, moving with the same deliberate slowness that seems built into the very soil of the landscape. Today, we drift deeper into the cabin itself, not just its physical structure, but the quiet routines, objects, and habits that made it a world of its own. Stone cabins were simple. You could list their contents in a minute or two, though doing so would miss the point. The magic, or perhaps the mild charm, lay in how each object carried generations of use. Let's begin at the hearth, the heart of the room. The hearth was more than a fireplace. It was the cabin's sun. Everything revolved around it. Meals were cooked there. Stories were told there. Clothes and boots were dried beside it, sometimes with varying degrees of success. Infants were warmed there. Old tools were repaired in its glow. The peat fire burned almost constantly throughout the year, though in summer it burned with modest restraint. Never wanting to appear over-enthusiastic, above the hearth hung a blackened iron hook, sturdy despite its age. Pots hung from it, mostly iron pots, though occasionally a clay pot survived long enough to hold broth or porridge. A wooden ladle rested nearby, smooth from decades of stirring. These tools were passed down through families with the same seriousness used when passing names or stories. The ladle, for example, might have belonged to someone's great-grandmother, who stirred soup during a storm that everyone still talked about because it was the family insisted the storm to which all other storms should be compared. People enjoyed these comparisons, though no one ever quite agreed which storm was truly the worst. From the hearth, let's drift across the cabin to the storage shelves. These shelves were usually made from driftwood, because driftwood was free and arrived on the shore with a frequency that suggested the ocean had a generous streak. The shelves held bowls carved from wood, plates that were sometimes slightly uneven, bundles of dried herbs, small clay jars, and the occasional object whose purpose had been forgotten somewhere between one generation and the next. The jars contained everything from salt to ash to dried berries. Families labeled nothing. Instead, they relied on memory, which was often accurate but sometimes led to surprising culinary results. On another wall hung tools, fishing knives, small axes, wooden paddles, bone needles, and the occasional metal hook. Everything had a place, though that place was rarely chosen for logical reasons. The hook, for instance, might hang beside the door simply because someone once placed it there after a long day and no one had bothered to move it since. There was a sense of this is where it has always been, that defined much of the cabin's interior design. Now let's drift downward, toward the floor. Floors varied from cabin to cabin, Some were stone, others were packed earth. Some had straw mats woven by hand, their fibers softening the hardness beneath. The mats wore down over the months, eventually becoming wisps of straw that drifted into corners. They were replaced each summer with fresh ones, woven from the long grasses that grew near the shore. The fresh mats smelled faintly of salt and sunlight, which did not improve them dramatically but did make them feel like part of a seasonal ritual. Beds were arranged along the walls. The word beds might be optimistic. They were platforms of wood or stone, topped with straw, covered by wool blankets. The blankets were dense, scratchy, and heavy enough to prevent cold air from entering through even the smallest gaps. Each family member had a designated sleeping space, though children often migrated during the night, seeking warmth or avoiding a draft that developed whenever the wind changed direction. The cabin was not large enough for privacy, but it was warm enough for comfort. In the far corner of the cabin, there was usually a small wooden chest. This chest held the family's most valuable possessions, though valuable. Here meant anything that would be difficult to replace. A little metal jewelry, a carved spoon, a comb, a letter from a relative who lived in a distant village, a pouch of coins that might never be used, considering that barter played a larger role than currency. The chest also held spare wool, because nothing was more valuable during winter than the promise of future warmth. Let's drift now into the routine of a typical day in late autumn, when the summer's work has faded into memory and the first hints of winter press against the walls. The family wakes as the light grows slowly along the horizon. The air inside the cabin is cool, but not unpleasant. Someone adds peat to the fire. Someone else opens the door briefly to check the weather, though the weather rarely surprises anyone. The landscape smells faintly of seaweed, damp earth, and the distant whisper of frost dot. After breakfast, the tasks begin. Some tasks repeat daily: tending the animals, fetching water, checking the nets, preparing food. Other tasks appear seasonally: repairing stone walls around the grazing fields, reinforcing the cabin exterior, gathering driftwood that the sea has thoughtfully delivered. But one task stands out in autumn more than any other: inspecting the stormlines. Stormlines were the invisible borders that families carried in their minds. Each person knew exactly how far they could travel safely during poor weather. The stones along the paths served as markers. These stones were familiar shapes: long ones, flat ones, round ones that helped people navigate through fog or snow. In autumn, families walked the paths carefully, ensuring that the stones were still visible, still steady, still trustworthy. Sometimes they adjusted them slightly, though always with a sense of respect, as if the stones themselves preferred not to be moved too abruptly. Let's drift now toward the concept of survival, not dramatic survival, but the steady, unassuming survival that defined life here. Stone cabins were not built for grandeur. They were built to endure. Every part of the cabin served that purpose. The low roof resisted the wind. The thick walls defied the cold. The narrow doorway kept out the worst of the storms. Families did not marvel at these features. They accepted them the way one accepts gravity or rain, as part of the world's unchanging nature. But survival involved more than architecture. It involved the quiet knowledge passed down through generations. Knowledge such as how to read the sky, how to gather peat during a dry stretch that might not come again for weeks, how to store fish in a way that discouraged insects, how to repair thatch before a storm arrived, how to walk across the moors in fog without wandering straight into a bog hole that looked far more solid than it actually was. This knowledge was not taught formally. It was observed, absorbed, repeated, and eventually woven into the routines of daily life. Let's drift quietly into evening, where the cabin once again becomes a place of warmth and rest. The family sits near the fire. Someone mends a sock. Someone else unravels an old length of rope that has become too tangled for practical use. The children listen to a story about a fisherman who once claimed to have caught a fish so large that it pulled him and his boat halfway to Iceland. No one believes the story, but everyone enjoys the telling of it. The firelight flickers across the stones. The roof creaks slightly as the temperature falls. Outside, the sky darkens into a deep blue, almost black. The first stars appear, though not many, because clouds prefer to linger in this region. The moon hangs low, casting a pale reflection on the sea dot inside. The air is warm. The smell of peat lingers. The family settles into a comfortable rhythm of small noises breathing, shifting, the fire crackling, someone coughing softly. These sounds form a kind of lullaby that guides everyone toward sleep. But before the night fully settles, let's drift even deeper into the culture of these coastal communities, because their relationship with storms was not simply practical, it was spiritual, emotional, and sometimes oddly affectionate. People believed the storms had character, not personalities necessarily, but moods. A mild storm was said to be in a thoughtful state. A harsh one was in a rage. A storm that lingered too long was described as confused about its priorities. These phrases carried no fear. They were simply ways of acknowledging that the weather here had a presence. It was part of the conversation of life. Some families kept small symbols near the hearth, meant to bring protection during storms. These might include a carved stone with markings whose meanings had been forgotten, or a feather tied to a string, or a piece of driftwood shaped like an animal. People did not rely on these charms, but they appreciated their presence in the same way one appreciates a yearly tradition that may or may not actually work. Certain rituals accompanied the arrival of storms. Doors were shut firmly but not slammed. The fire was fed before the wind grew strong. Children were encouraged to stay away from windows. Someone always stepped outside briefly before the storm arrived to feel the air, to predict the storm's direction, or simply because stepping outside before a storm was something people had always done. This ritual made no practical difference, but it created a familiarity that eased the mind. Let's drift into the middle of winter again, because winter is where the stone cabin reveals its full purpose. Snow falls lightly outside. The ground turns white and then unevenly brown and then white again, depending on how the wind moves it around. Families spend long hours indoors. The cabin feels smaller with each passing week, though it never feels oppressive. The fire is kept alive constantly, and peat supplies dwindle with predictable anxiety. Winter also brings moments of quiet beauty. The frost clings to the stones in delicate patterns. Icicles form along the roof line, though they rarely last long before a warmer gust breaks them off. The sea in winter looks darker, deeper, more ancient. Waves crash with a slow, deliberate force, as if reminding the land that the ocean has been here much longer. Inside, the family settles into their winter habits. Someone spins wool. Someone sharpens tools. Someone repairs clothing. The children play small games involving pebbles or carved figures. The adults speak in low tones about the coming spring, though they know spring will take its time. The cabin holds all of this: the warmth, the waiting, the repetition of days that differ only slightly from one another. Life here is not marked by dramatic events. It is marked by seasons, storms, and the slow unfolding of time. The cabin endures with the same patience shown by the people inside.